Welcome to Cut Through, the podcast that helps to make video content accessible to more creators. Cut through the noise on a wide range of topics to help you break down those barriers and to bring your ideas to life. In today's episode, we talk about mastering budget conversations in creative work, learning how you can build trust and navigate the awkwardness of money talk. Let's get started.
Morning, Mike. I assume it's morning where you are.
Are we playing that game? It is, actually. Thanks for being observant.
We're going to talk about budgets and briefs and the age-old issue that seems to come up, which is having that effective conversation about the cost of a creative project. And this is sort of something that often comes up, this awkward moment between a potential client and a vendor. And that first interaction, it tends to always be quite awkward. I have an idea of something I want to achieve, but I've only got a certain amount of money. I just want to see whether I'm on the same page, and I'm not sure. It's this awkward thing that always seems to come up. So
It's a taboo, right? It's akin to meeting someone at a cocktail party and saying, "How much money do you make?" It's for whatever reason, it seems to have taken that connotation of being the forbidden topic to talk money. And I think we'll dive right in, but I think the way I was kind of thinking that way, it's like no one wants to lead that conversation. It's like the classic negotiation. No one wants to start on the wrong page, and no one wants to get taken advantage of. So, how do you have that conversation, knowing that it's probably one of the most important conversations to have early, because then it sets up all the expectations and the trust gets formed. But how do you breach? Who makes the first move, I guess, is the question. And what are the things, I guess, what are the different variables that we can talk about today to help people feel more comfortable, I guess, making that first move and feeling comfortable to talk about money sooner rather than later? Yeah, perhaps it's not the first thing out of your mouth, but it shouldn't be the last thing out of your mouth.
So why is it such an awkward conversation though? Like, why does it always seem to be invariably this very awkward thing for, I'd say 80% of the time it is?
Well, I'll answer, I guess, maybe the first one from just the first thing that came to my head with my background is spending a lot of time on client side. I think there's sometimes I guess a fear, deep down fear, that you don't want the service provider to conveniently come back with a number that you think might be the right number. And as a marketing guy, you don't want to spend too much for something. You don't want to get ripped off. You don't want to make a bad decision. You don't want your boss to basically say you don't know how to manage a project, because that's what you're basically trying to prove to get promoted in your organization. So no one wants to say I got 20 grand and it cost 20 grand and it could have easily cost 10 grand if you just thought through what you really wanted versus what you think you needed. And I think so basically, it has to be a two-sided conversation where I guess there has to be a level of honesty.
But let me give you a scenario though. Let's say Joe X from a medium-sized business who doesn't do a lot of marketing, wants to do some digital ads, but he doesn't know the first thing about how to approach that or what to do. How's he going to know what's the variables are? Like how would he approach? How do you think he should approach a vendor? So like I come to you and say, look, I want to produce some digital ads for Facebook, for YouTube. I'm not really sure. What's the first thing you would ask me?
How much money do you have?
Well, yeah, kind of a bit like that, isn't it? Well, what's your budget really, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that's kind of the point. I think asking that early is something that the creative providers need to do, even though it's reluctant. I guess it's, maybe it's more into buckets of, is it high end? Is it medium end? What do you have in mind? I guess the question I usually ask is, what do you have in mind? Like, what do you kind of envision this? How is the ad going to be used? Who are you going to be talking to? I guess, what media do you plan on using? I guess it goes back to, I think the original topic you were saying is the brief is, what's the intended use of this piece of content? Because if it's just a quick tutorial and it's a simple how-to, does it have to have all the polish of a TVC? Does it need all the lighting? Does it need a 7-person crew? Can it be shot in your office? Is it a tutorial? I think So I think you stop back to the basics of a brief. Really, is I guess we've always talked about this. Who's your audience? Um, what's the vehicle? So where are they going to watch it? And how? And then that will start informing the different treatments or different approaches to the shoot that I think then will logically lead to that next conversation, which is, well, these treatments tend to be more money because of X, Y, and Z, or these treatments are much cheaper because you only need one camera. You're gonna bring your own talent. It's you, or it's the managing director, or it's a sales person. We don't have to bring in anyone outside.
So thinking about that from that point of view, I kind of just dawned on me there are probably kind of three categories of people, client side, three sort of broad categories. Speculative, people who really don't know what they want just yet, but they know they need to do something and they have an idea. And let's say they're naive to the processes and they've just, maybe this is their first foray and they're not that comfortable with it, which would be quite a few people. Then there's probably a middle group that has a clear idea of what they want to do with and how much they want to spend. But still, they're not completely sure. So they're in that sort of just know enough, but not quite everything. And then there's a third group who really know exactly what they want to do, how much they're going to spend, and who their audience is, and they're quite developed. So they're kind of like, I'd say, three categories, really.
Yeah. Well, I would say I would even go far as to say I would reckon most people in the middle category.
Most people I would probably, but hey, let's just try this out. Let's take the first category, the speculative person who's trying to get a feel for what they should be doing. And they know they want to do something and they've got an idea. So how might they want to approach it with the vendor? So
Yeah, well, I was going to say for that, I think it's more about I think it's taking a further step back and listen and really try to understand what they're trying to accomplish, because they tend to come to you with I want to make a video, right? But have they really thought that through? Does that really make sense? Have you thought about why you want to make a video? Like I said, in the other ones, I think the middle categories know they want to make a video, but they're then figuring out what's the most efficient or most value I can get in making video, or could we do it this way versus this way? They have enough knowledge to know that they know why they're doing the video. They just don't want to get. That's I think the category I introduced with, which is they don't want to go down the wrong path. They don't want to do a poor job. They don't want to get ripped off. That's the category I tend to over focus on. But you're right. In the very beginning, I think it's just a real honest conversation and to try to tease out the why, the reasons, the marketing objective, the communication objective. And it's interesting, at least in my experience, when you have that conversation, you just basically help them think through their own brief. It's almost like you help them write the brief by discussing it. It starts to become self-evident. And I've noticed, and this is where I think it's useful, is that's when the budget conversation starts to reveal itself kind of organically, as opposed to saying, hey, how much money you got? Because maybe that's too confrontational. It's like you feel like you're being put on the spot. It's like, well, I don't know how much money I have. How much do well, I guess is a response to that is often, well, how much do I need? And that's the classic, I think, how long is a piece of string, which look, it always happens in this industry of there's variance and the variance is so wide.
So to help them is a case study or a cost range with examples of different, once you've fleshed out kind of what their goal is and what they want to achieve, providing examples with cost ranges or case studies, is that a good way to, or is that something they should ask for?
Well, it would be great if they had something in mind, but to your point, if they're pretty new at it, they may not have a bunch of things at their fingertips that they're thinking of, or even be in the right mind space. I think obviously, ideally, you'd have examples in your existing work or your portfolio that you can then point them to.
Yeah, gotcha. You need to you really, so if I'm that, because like I'm going to put this as something more helpful to a person who's looking to get something done and they may not know. Your first probably port of call is having a conversation to try and get a better understanding of what you want to achieve.
Yeah, and to your point about being comfortable with it, I think just an honest conversation back and forth. And I think any creative provider, I think it's best served to be just as open and honest as opposed to trying to walk them towards an outcome that you're looking for, or really listen to what they're looking for. Because I think no one wants to feel like they're being pulled in a direction. It's like, well, you don't want to pull them to a direction that's more profitable for you at the expense of not truly listening to what they want. Meaning, if someone really just wants a simple video, don't try to sell them on a complex video because you want to get an extra job that month. Because that's a high risk.
It's like developing a common understanding with them about what they want.
Well, that's it. Actually, that's probably one of the takeaways. Is how do you? Well, developing a common understanding is pretty much an obvious but very important place. And I think what we're teasing out here is how do you get to a common understanding? And I think for the I guess the naive or that one group, it's about, I guess, not making them feel uncomfortable about not knowing what they want. I think that's part of the intimidation factor. So let me just comment on that, because I think there's an element of they don't want to feel silly talking to a creative agency because they don't know what they want. And I think there can be an inherent embarrassment, even though there shouldn't be. There's no reason to be embarrassed. I think that's the mindset shift that you want to get, is go, look, I don't know. I just know. You go back to basics of marketing, right? I know what my brand is. I know what I want the brand to achieve. I know what my competitive set is. I know what my differentiating point is. And I know how I want to position myself to potential buyers. I just don't know what I can do with what I got.
So when should you start talking numbers? Because we seem to be dancing around the topic. I don't really know. Like, when should I start talking?
I think you've done it right there, because as part of managing expectations, once you've established, I think, these buckets of kind of ranges of options, those ranges have to have a number. You can achieve this from X to Y. You can achieve this from A to B.
Well, you're talking managing expectations there, and I think that's initially going to be sorted out pretty quickly. There's that third group though that's kind of interesting, which is the more a more seasoned operator who knows a little bit about their marketing and their video marketing needs and what they want to achieve. They've got a very clear budget. They've got a very clear outcome in mind. They've got a very clear audience. Are they people that should, like, if they're meeting a vendor for the first time, should they be coming out with their numbers straight away, or is it the same sort of process?
I think it's a similar process. I think it's just farther along the process. I think it's more about getting a range and contextualizing that as well. I think when you're talking about that third group, I think the most important, this is when, let's just put it out there, the importance of a brief. I think briefs are generally still underappreciated and undervalued as a tool. I think in the early, if you're looking at the buckets, I would say then when you get to that third bucket, the expectation of a polished brief is higher and expected and necessary, because at that stage, the people involved should know that then, because I guess there's still always a risk of subjectivity without a good written brief, right? If it's what I think, because I mean, it's creative 101. It's you never evaluate a brief on whether you should never evaluate a creative execution on a qualitative measure. It always should be against the brief. That brings in as much objectivity as possible. You're dealing with the creative process. So I would expect, if there was a spectrum or a graph, the farther along you are in the experience category, the expectation of a more polished brief and following the brief more religiously, I think, becomes expected and necessary.
Does that mean, hey, here's the brief, I'm going to give you an estimate based on the brief specifically?
But the brief itself, it can be substandard.
Is that what you're saying? You're saying you provided me a brief, and what you should expect from me is a number that honors that brief, or I think will achieve the brief, and that's what you should expect from me.
Yes.
Okay. I have a slightly different perspective on that, because I still think
what do you think?
Because I think it is still there. I still think common understanding is important. There is a lot of variance in the world. There's a lot of different ways to approach things. And I think common understanding is, going back to what we said in all three categories, that common understanding needs to be there. So I always think it's important to establish a very clear understanding of kind of capabilities, cost ranges, case studies, so that you can really hone in on what they want. But also what you want to do with the client and as a vendor is you want to make sure you're on the same page together, because if they're wildly off the mark in terms of what they think they should be paying, and if you're wildly off the mark in terms of what the market really should be charging, you're kind of both wasting each other's time. And that's as a vendor, that's the biggest fear I have, is my time being wasted. And as a client, you don't want to look silly and you don't want to. So,
I think you nailed that on the head. In fact, just to reiterate, I completely agree with everything. And in fact, I think establishing a common understanding is the goal always. I think what I'm getting at is the farther along you are, the sophistication spectrum in the brief, there should be less risk of a disconnect. It should be you should be on the same page more times than not. There should be less risk of failing in that endeavor, if that makes sense. Because sometimes you can get a brief that's, listen, we all admit it, it's substandard, but you know what they want, you kind of know what they mean, and you still want to do the project because you don't want the project to go away because they feel like, oh, I don't know how to write a proper brief, and you don't want to discourage them. So you kind of, I mean, this is potentially another topic we haven't even discussed bringing up, but the beauty of the reverse brief.
just before you get there, what is a reverse brief? We don't need, I don't want, it's probably too big a topic, but just in case anyone wanted to know what a reverse brief is.
Now, a reverse brief is a little, it's kind of I wouldn't say a trick, but it's a nice technique to help a client be a better client and to help them get themselves across the line by literally having a conversation like this about, what are you trying to accomplish? Tell me about your business. What are we doing? And with the experience of doing this a few times, you basically you feed it back to them, and you basically feed yourself the brief using what you think they were trying to achieve.
It's a good way to get there.
Why I find that useful is, especially being on this side of it now, I find that really helps me understand their brand needs or their project needs more than I do when I just listen. Because if you have to, it's the classic, if you can, it's just like classic tutoring, right? With a math problem. If you could do a math problem, that's great. But if you can explain to someone how to do the math problem, then you're a master of it. So if I'm able to explain to them what they meant to explain to me, I'm very confident I have a very good feel of what needs to happen next. And then that's where I think you can confidently have the conversation and talk budgets and talk numbers and say, hey, I basically told you what I think you told me. Does that still make sense? And if it does, you could say, okay, based on that, I think here are your options. I think you have a low budget option, you have a medium budget option, but what you thought you had that's off the table because you've asked for this. And it's interesting, at that stage, you're either getting that common understanding that you were searching for, or perhaps you're starting over again and you're recalibrating.
Let me throw a scenario to you based on a lot of this conversation, because this is the one I personally dislike the most, which is, all right, let's say 0 to 10, the one person is the speculative, doesn't really know a hell of a lot, but they're trying to get things done. And the 10 or the 9 person is somebody who's got a lot of experience. So I'm going to be around the 6 or the 7. Okay. I want a TBC, a 30-seconder. I want a 15-seconder, and I want to shoot at my location. Can you give me a budget?
Yeah, that's always the fun part. And I think we usually do that. That's generally that's enough to have a good conversation. Probably not enough to give
me, I'm going to you, but I'm also going to go 4 other people, and I'm going to get some numbers, because that's for me. And the reason I pose it is, I find that very difficult to do. I find I find I don't want to do it, even though I have a very clear process, and I don't make numbers up out of thin air, but I find that very difficult to do. And it does come up from time to time where it's like an auction or a tendering process. It's very difficult.
That's a whole nother topic about the role. actually, let's shelve that. The role of how much spec work is fair for any job. And I think that's a whole topic you should take on itself, which is the
As a
role of pitching.
client, personally, if I wouldn't recommend doing that
Doing
personally,
which bit?
going to a vendor with that sort of process, unless it was a very, very well established brief.
Yes. I
But
think
even then, I think it's hard to do.
so. I think I'll do my reverse briefing. What you're saying is that it's kicking tires can be. I think you're calling it kicking tires. It can be dangerous because it can draw on resources unfairly.
Why do I care? It's your company, not mine.
Right, right. Well, I think long term, it's one of those things that if you build a reputation for taking advantage of people, um, I don't think that'll pay off.
Yeah, I don't think it's a great way to operate personally. And
But there can be, I think there's the distinction between, I think intent, like a lot of things in life, intent matters. And could you be wrong on the intention? Yeah. Have I been wrong? Yes. Meaning some people are literally saying, hey, I just need help here. I think, all right, to answer that question more directly, though, I think I feel better. And I guess you don't know at the time, but it feels like if you do a pretty heavy tire kick, if the project goes forward, you expect them to hire you. I think where it becomes yucker and
it's happened many times to us, though.
well, I know, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but yeah, when you go too far, asking someone to kind of help you frame in your project, and I think I know where you're going, and then they use that to then refine their brief and then pitch it out to get a lower price. Well, that has a ethical connotation that was difficult.
I think look. I think you would do it for two reasons. One, you want competition, and two, you want to unearth different levels of skills and capabilities, and you want to sort of marry those things up against each other to get the best outcome.
If that's the goal, and that's a valid goal, then you better have a better brief. You can't be kicking tires.
Okay, so if you have a good brief and you're very clear
Yeah.
about what you're trying to do, so
Hey,
all right,
I'm
here's my
talking to
brief.
3 or
I'm
4
actually
vendors.
yeah.
Here's my relative budget. It's a one-off project or it's an ongoing retainer. Because that will inform any creative group. And to be quite blunt, is how much should I invest in this opportunity?
Which is actually a really, there's a lot of integrity in that approach, which is great. And in fact, I think I've seen many of those approaches where they actually give you a budget as well, and they're actually saying, can you make it work for this number, and how would you make it work for this number, and show me what your levels of capabilities are.
That's fair. That's a fair and transparent process. And to that, it's something you've brought up to me. I won't name off the back of where that happened, but what about feedback if you're not successful? How important is that? Now, again, I guess we're getting off the topic of budget, but it's all related because it's all about what's a reasonable approach to get to the project parameters that a client wants to spend to create a video goal, and how much input do they need from potential vendors to solidify that to a point. And I think back to your scale of the 3 buckets, farther along the ride, they've done this many times and they know, look, here's my relative budget. I know it's a pretty big production. I know it's going to be decent media. I know it has to be a bit polished because it's going to be on paid media. We have a premium brand. All that stuff has to happen. It's a very aspirational kind of ad. It's not a functional 5-minute education video. They're all very different functions of the video that will inform all this stuff.
Yeah, and I think with the example, and the reason I wanted to bring up that example was because while it's a valid approach, it does bring in the whole managing expectations, looking at those variables and the cost considerations of those variables. For example, your casting, are you going tier A or are you looking at a lower tier? Because that's hugely different. I mean, I remember that great story I always told you where I had a particular budget with a I think it was a crowdfunding video we were working on, and client was looking at different types of models, and we were trying to find the models for this particular crowd. And then I went to an agency and gave them a budget of what we were there, and I got told I was inconsequential.
There is something in that, which this is my feeble attempt to segue, is transparency, though. As much transparency as possible in the process, especially when it comes to numbers, is better than not. Meaning, yes, there could be some awkwardness, there could be some disconnects, but that's minor versus the disconnect. If you aren't transparent and there's sticker shock, I think you've used the word a lot with me. Occasionally, it's like, no one wants sticker shock. And I'm like, well, I completely 100% agree. Now, sometimes sticker shock, though, is important to establish, hey, do you realize what you're asking for is expensive? So sometimes they need a shock. And I mean that because the expectation is in the wrong place. So maybe you need a little shock to get them into place.
Which is going back to what you said as your first kind of thing, which is always the common understanding. And then from there, managing expectations.
And then to segue the numbers, to me, is transparency of the line items. It used to be my personal bugaboo, and I guess I've gotten over it more as I've gotten older, but I used to always hate the lump sum estimate. Like, someone gives you a number and you just go, did you just make that up? Now, what I used to underestimate, when I used to get frustrated, I underestimated the fact that these are experts. They've done this a million times. Like a plumber, they know their job, they know their industry, they know what things cost, and they've done it a million times. And that number is probably within 20% of being right. But when I see those round numbers, I just feel like they're just guessing and they're going to charge me that. So I think one approach that, obviously we subscribe to is line items, and as much line items as possible, because I think by doing line items, and I've noticed this in practice, is it becomes much easier to explain why things are expensive because so basically if you do a line item, which is crew cost, one is talent.
Expensive is probably not the right word. Why things cost what they cost.
Yes. What did I say? I didn't say that.
You said expensive. I think that's just, it's an assumption there that something's expensive.
That's an important point of clarity, and I would agree. That's the kind of sloppiness you want to avoid in a brief, right? Is what I just did, which is using words like it's expensive. It's not expensive, it's a cost. So to your point, when you itemize the line items and those things then make up that total number that's spit out, if they go, wow, that's much higher than I expected, back to managing expectations, you say, okay, let's go through the line items. Which line item is getting your attention? And the reason you do it that systematically, they said, well, talent, okay, but you asked for a seasoned performer that could deliver a TBC and represent your brand well. Okay.
Those people, they need royalties. So you're going to be paying every year for a royalty for them to use it.
Right. And that's what I meant by the transparency of the line items, right? It's like, well, okay, you want us to come up with a brand new idea from scratch, not take an idea you've already written. You want us to write a script and do a storyboard and evaluate different ideas. How much time do you think that takes? So that line item is the development of the creative idea, the writing of the script, the feedback loops, the storyboarding, the concepting, the thinking time. So once what I notice in all this is when you give those line items, not every line item, every little thing within the thing, but the big buckets of stuff, the creative work, the pre-work, the shooting or the acquisition, the talent, the out-of-pocket costs, all that can be bucketed. And what I've noticed, and this is where I guess helpful if anyone's listening to this, is when you think of it in those buckets, and then you realize those are the variables you can turn to then change your budget back to where you want it. So it's not like you're stuck, because it's like, well, okay, well that's too expensive. So what can we do because that's too expensive? Okay, let's get away from the talent. Let's talk about doing a voiceover read.
But just using this as an opportunity to circle back though, because this is kind of circling back to something we were talking about before about the, putting out a brief to tender is what we would call it, where you have a very set number and a very set of deliverables and you're going to farm it out to 5 companies. Just a word of warning to that approach for people, unless you're a very seasoned producer who understands the nuances of producing, that approach, you're not going to get the nuances. There are all these nuances within that. And I think that's one thing you could possibly miss out on understanding.
Yeah, but like you said, yeah, and I hope I didn't mislead that. Even when you have a season brief, you still discuss all the elements that lead up to it. It
But
just should
often,
be a smoother
often
conversation.
the farm out to tender approach, you
True.
miss the
Yeah.
nuances, and that's actually something I kind of just realized today, which is why I've always disliked that approach because all the nuances, which is why I struggle when I get a brief like that and I have to submit an estimate and send it out, and you may not ever get feedback, but and you may ever have a discussion, but it's like, well, you've asked for a casting here. Did you want a tier A casting with royalties, or are you looking for somebody maybe a bit more unseasoned who's looking for an opportunity? Because you got this kind of range in that. And do you want crafted and do you want composed music or non-composed music? And you know, I,
Literally where I wanted to go with this. It's like it's funny because what we said is once you address those variables, when the transparency and the line items, and start discussing through what those means and how those can be altered, then basically it gets to the kind of really final kind of, I guess, concluding point is it's the scope refinement, right? So through that process, then you refine that scope and adjust the brief, and expectations are managed. And guess what? You go back full circle. You're back to the common understanding, and then you can actively go. And I think the big picture for me in this is, it doesn't have to be. Sorry, back to budgets. It doesn't have to be such a difficult conversation. Um, I think I think more times than not, when you bring it up early in a conversation, that's gonna be the first thing you say because that can create, I said, some disconnect. You want to kind of understand before you talk numbers, but by addressing them early, the transparency, that's where the trust starts to get built, and that's when the value can be delivered, and value gets delivered. It's always value, right? It's never price. It's always, I mean, it's consumer marketing 101, but it even goes for business to business arrangements. It's value. It's I want to get something and I can get good value for it. So it's not just the price, it's the quality or you know, the performance of the output vis-a-vis what was paid for it.
but look, how to have an effective conversation with the cost of creative projects. I'll just go through a list of different things here. We've got the common understanding is probably your first step.
Yep.
So step one, you probably want to find that common understanding.
Yep.
So common understanding in your mind is just really understanding getting on the same page about what wants to be achieved. Yeah. Then I think managing expectations and deliverables. I mean, where in this process are you starting to talk numbers? Somewhere
Right
in
here.
that process.
Right about
Okay.
here, I would say. And then I would add to that, yeah, let's put the numbers out there. This is the time where the numbers should be thrown out because I think by then you've established a level of trust and understanding where the numbers are not part of a game or it's part of a process of getting to the right outcome.
Yeah, and as a client, it's really important. I think also once you've gone through that process and you're starting to have that trust, I think the last level of trust I think is ask for an itemized estimate. Really ask for line items so you can really understand it. And that's not about just holding somebody to the coals and making sure they're an honest person. It's about really understand where things are, because there are sometimes opportunities there that you can actually, if you are cost sensitive, that you can actually pull things back if you have to.
Let me throw in another thing I think didn't come up, but it's part of that as well. Sometimes you can make, and I've done this, you make the wrong assumption. Oh, I thought you wanted us to do X, Y, Z. Oh, you just need to just do A. Well, that's fine. That whole line item goes away. Thanks for pointing that out. I misunderstood that. And there's honesty, transparency, and there's the benefit of it, right? Because I might have had a number in there that was completely had nothing to do with what he was asking, but it's something that I thought he needed. And that's again, without that transparency, you show up on the set and go, well, why do we got this? It's like, well, that was part of the estimate. It's that kind of, it's scrutinizing where the variables that come to the big number.
Okay. Look, I think the big takeaway though is it doesn't have to be a difficult conversation. I mean, that's the huge takeaway here is you can actually have an honest conversation which is transparent and open, and you can achieve the result that you want.
And the key is doing that early. And if it means having a little bit, taking a step back to getting a little bit more conversational before you then get back to it, I think that's quite adequate.
Absolutely. And look, just to reiterate, I don't think it needs to be a difficult conversation. I think it's important to get to that common understanding and to get a sense of where you're at and what you need. To have that money talk early on, and then to go through, the expectations and having those managed with variance and approaches, getting that line item sort of estimate across so that you can sort of see what's going to happen and how it's going to happen and what the costs are. And I think if you can do those things, you can actually develop a pretty good relationship and find that right fit, as you said. So
that's a wrap on this episode of Cut Through. If you liked it, hit subscribe, and if you've got thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. See you next time.